What if the people who seem to control every room they walk into, the ones who never panic, never get rattled, never get pulled into someone else's chaos, what if they are not naturally gifted with that ability? What if they simply learned something that you haven't been taught yet? There is a kind of person that situations never seem to own. You have seen them. Maybe you have sat across from them in a meeting where everything was falling apart, and watched them remain completely still. Not frozen. Not detached. But still. Like something deep inside them was anchored to a floor that the storm couldn't reach. You have watched them navigate conflict without becoming the conflict. Absorb pressure without transmitting it. Walk into rooms charged with tension and somehow, without raising their voice, without performing authority, without doing anything you could point to and precisely name, shift the entire atmosphere. And you have probably wondered, at some point, what they know that you don't. The answer is not charisma. It is not confidence in the way most people describe confidence, that loud, assertive, chest-forward energy that actually signals insecurity to anyone paying close enough attention. The answer is something quieter and more devastating than any of that. It is the understanding, deep, practiced, embodied understanding, of how situations actually work. Where the real power in any situation lives. And how to position yourself, internally and externally, so that power flows toward you rather than away from you. That is what we are building today. The first thing you need to understand is that most people are not responding to situations. They are responding to their interpretation of situations. And that distinction, that seemingly small, almost philosophical distinction, is actually the entire game. Here is what happens inside most people when a high-pressure situation emerges. A crisis at work. A confrontation in a relationship. An unexpected setback that dismantles a plan they were counting on. What happens is not a response to the situation itself. What happens is a response to the story their mind tells about the situation, instantaneously, automatically, before they have consciously chosen anything. This is a disaster. I cannot handle this. Everyone is watching. I am going to fail. This person is attacking me. I have no control here. The story arrives in milliseconds. And because it arrives so fast, faster than conscious thought, faster than deliberate evaluation, most people mistake it for reality. They treat the interpretation as if it were the situation. And then they react accordingly. The panic is not a response to what is happening. The panic is a response to the story. And here is why this matters so profoundly: the person who controls the story controls the situation. Not because they are deluding themselves. Not because they are pretending things are fine when they are not. But because they have trained themselves, through practice and through philosophy, to pause between the situation and the story. To examine the story before they live inside it. To ask, is this interpretation accurate? Is this the only way to see what is happening? What would change if I framed this differently? Marcus Aurelius, who governed an empire at war, managed plague, navigated betrayal, and faced pressures that would have shattered most human beings, returned obsessively to this practice in his private journals. He wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself but to your estimate of it, and this you have the power to revoke at any moment. Your estimate. Your interpretation. Your story. Revoke it. Rewrite it. And watch what happens to your experience of the situation." There was a negotiator named Paul. Paul worked in high-stakes corporate disputes, the kind where millions of dollars and dozens of careers hung on the outcome of a single conversation. His reputation in his industry was almost mythological. People said he never lost his composure. That he could walk into a room where both sides were ready to burn everything down and somehow, within an hour, have everyone at the table talking productively. A journalist once asked him what his secret was. Paul thought about it for a long moment. And then he said something the journalist didn't expect. "I never walk into a room trying to control other people. I walk in having already controlled myself. Everything else follows from that." The journalist pressed him. What does that actually mean in practice? Paul explained it like this. Before every high-stakes conversation, no matter how time-pressured, no matter how much was at stake, he spent a minimum of 5 minutes alone. Not reviewing his arguments. Not rehearsing his talking points. Just getting still. Finding the place inside himself that was not afraid of the outcome. That could tolerate uncertainty. That was anchored in his values rather than in his need to win. Because Paul understood something that most people spend their careers never learning. You cannot control a room you are afraid of. The fear is visible. Not always loudly. But it leaks, in the micro-expressions, in the slightly too quick responses, in the defensiveness that masquerades as confidence, in the aggression that is actually anxiety wearing armor. And the moment a room senses your fear, the power shifts away from you. The first step to controlling any situation is to stop needing the situation to go a particular way. Not because outcomes don't matter. But because the attachment to a specific outcome is precisely what makes you reactive rather than responsive. Anxious rather than clear. Controllable rather than in control. Detach from the outcome. Anchor in the values. And then, from that grounded, unhurried place, engage. The second thing that separates people who control situations from people who are controlled by them is the management of silence. Most people are terrified of silence. In a conversation, in a negotiation, in a conflict, silence feels like a void that must be immediately filled. And so they fill it. With words that haven't been thought through. With concessions they didn't intend to make. With explanations nobody asked for. With the verbal equivalent of nervous movement, talking to manage their own discomfort rather than to communicate anything of actual value. And in doing so, they hand over the power of the situation to whoever is comfortable enough to wait. There is a woman named Adiz who runs a mid-sized technology company in a competitive industry. She is known among her peers for something that makes people who negotiate against her mildly uncomfortable. When she is asked a question she doesn't immediately want to answer, or when someone makes a demand she is evaluating, she does something almost no one else does. She pauses. Not a polite, apologetic pause. A real one. 5 seconds. Sometimes 10. Sometimes longer. She looks at the person across from her with complete calm, not challenging them, not performing anything, just genuinely thinking. Genuinely evaluating. Taking the time she actually needs before she speaks. And in that silence, something interesting happens every time. The other person talks. They fill the silence with additional information. With clarifications that reveal more than they intended. With concessions they make preemptively because the silence makes them nervous and they interpret it as dissatisfaction. Adiz told a mentor once, silence is the most underused tool in any room. The person who can sit in it comfortably always knows more by the end of the conversation than the person who couldn't. The management of silence is not passive. It is one of the most active, intentional, sophisticated things you can do in any high-stakes interaction. Practice being comfortable with pauses. Practice not rushing to fill the quiet. Practice letting your words arrive when they are ready rather than when anxiety pushes them out. Because the person who controls the pace of a conversation controls the conversation. And silence controls the pace. The third principle is one that sounds almost paradoxical until you sit with it long enough for it to open. The less you need to be right, the more power you have in any situation. Most people walk into conflicts, conversations, and high-pressure situations carrying an invisible but extraordinarily heavy burden, the need to be validated. To be agreed with. To have their perspective acknowledged as correct. To win, not just the practical outcome, but the ideological battle. To leave the situation not just having achieved their goal, but having been seen as right in the process. And that need, that deep, human, understandable need, is a leash. Because whoever holds the other end of it controls you completely. All they have to do is withhold the validation. Disagree with the perspective. Refuse to acknowledge the point. And immediately, your energy shifts from pursuing the actual outcome to pursuing the agreement. You get louder, more insistent, more emotional, more focused on being understood than on being effective. And the situation, which you were trying to control, now controls you. A mentor of mine used to say something that took me years to fully absorb: the most powerful person in any room is the one who needs the least from it. Think about what that means in practice. When you genuinely do not need someone's approval, their agreement, their validation, their acknowledgement that you were right, you become almost impossible to manipulate. Because the primary lever most people use to control others is the withholding or granting of approval. Remove your need for it and the lever has nothing to pull. This is not indifference. This is not the performance of not caring, which is actually just caring desperately while pretending not to. This is the genuine, practiced, philosophically grounded freedom of a person who has located their sense of worth inside themselves rather than in the reactions of the room around them. Epictetus wrote, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." Translated into the language of situational power, stop needing the room to confirm your reality. Bring your own confirmation. Walk in already knowing what you know. Already grounded in what you value. Already clear about what you are there to accomplish, regardless of whether everyone else agrees it is worth accomplishing. That clarity is untouchable. And untouchable people, in any room, in any situation, under any pressure, are the people situations cannot own. There is a story about a general that I find myself returning to whenever I think about this. He was not the largest general. Not the most decorated. Not the one with the most resources or the most celebrated military history. But he was known throughout his entire career for one thing above all else. He never made decisions under pressure. He made decisions before pressure arrived. Before every campaign, before every negotiation, every confrontation, every high-stakes engagement, this general sat with his most trusted advisors and they mapped every scenario that could reasonably unfold. Every way the situation could go wrong. Every response the enemy might produce. Every resource that might fail at the critical moment. Not to produce anxiety, but to eliminate it. Because what produces panic in the moment of crisis is not the crisis itself. It is the surprise of the crisis. The sense that what is happening was not anticipated, was not prepared for, was not something you have already, in the quiet of preparation, decided how to handle. This general was never surprised. Not because he could predict the future. But because he had already sat with every version of the future he could imagine, and decided, calmly and clearly, how he would respond to each one. By the time the battle began, his decisions were already made. He was simply executing. And execution, clean, decisive, unencumbered by the noise of panic, looks, to everyone watching, exactly like the kind of unshakable control that most people believe is a personality trait rather than a practice. It is not a personality trait. It is preparation. Sit with the scenarios before they arrive. Ask yourself, genuinely, seriously, without rushing past the discomfort, what is the worst realistic version of this situation? And if it happens, what will I do? Answer that question in the quiet. And then carry the answer into the room. You will never be the same in a crisis again. The fourth principle brings everything together, and it is the one that most directly determines whether you control a situation or the situation controls you. Energy is the real language of every room. Before a single word is spoken in any human interaction, before the argument begins, before the negotiation opens, before the confrontation unfolds, something is already being communicated. Something is already being read and interpreted and responded to by every nervous system in the space. Energy. The quality of your presence. The groundedness or anxiety in your body. The certainty or desperation in your bearing. The sense, which people pick up before they can articulate it, of whether you are someone who is in possession of yourself or someone who is at the mercy of the circumstances around them. People do not primarily respond to what you say. They respond to what you are when you say it. And what you are, in any given moment, is a direct reflection of the state you have cultivated inside yourself before you walked into the room. This is why the most powerful communicators in history were not always the most articulate. Why the most effective leaders were not always the most intelligent. Why the people who consistently control situations, who shift atmospheres by their presence, who calm chaos by entering it, who resolve conflicts that others have only escalated, are not doing something technical. They are being something fundamental. They are being people who have done enough internal work, enough stoic practice, enough honest self-examination, enough cultivation of their inner world, that what they radiate when they enter a space is not anxiety or need or defensiveness or the desperation to be seen as competent. What they radiate is settledness. And settledness, genuine, unperformed, deeply rooted settledness, is the most contagious energy in any room. It does not demand attention. It simply has it. It does not assert authority. It simply carries it. It does not try to control. And therefore, everything around it naturally organizes itself in response to it. We have covered the foundational architecture in this first part. The understanding that situations are controlled at the level of interpretation, not reaction. The power of silence and what it reveals and creates. The freedom that comes from releasing the need to be right. The preparation that eliminates panic before it can arrive. And the truth that energy, not words, not strategy, not force, is the primary language of every room. There is something nobody tells you about the moments where you lose control of a situation. It doesn't happen when things get hard. It happens before that. In the seconds before the conversation begins. In the quiet before the confrontation arrives. In the space between hearing the news and deciding what it means. That is where control is lost, not in the dramatic moment everyone is watching, but in the invisible moment nobody sees. And that is exactly where we are going today. Because part 1 gave you the foundation. The understanding of how situations actually work at their deepest level. The principles that separate people who control rooms from people who are controlled by them. Part 2 gives you the edge. The specific, precise, immediately applicable understanding of how control is lost, and how to keep it. How people attempt to take power from you in situations, and why those attempts stop working the moment you see them clearly. And what it means to build the kind of person, from the inside out, that situations simply cannot own. Let's finish this. The moment control is most frequently lost is not the moment of conflict. It is the moment of surprise. And surprise, in almost every case, is not an accident. The people who consistently destabilize others in situations are operating on a very specific and very reliable principle. They understand, whether consciously or through years of instinct, that a person who is surprised is a person who is reactive. And a person who is reactive has, in that moment, surrendered the wheel. Think about how this plays out in practice. The colleague who drops critical information at the last possible moment, not because they forgot, but because they understand that late information produces scrambling, and scrambling produces errors, and errors shift the power dynamic in their favor. The person in a negotiation who suddenly introduces a new demand when everything seemed settled, not because the demand is genuinely new, but because the disruption of the apparent resolution creates pressure, and pressure applied at the right moment extracts concessions that calm conversation never would. The individual in a personal relationship who chooses the worst possible moment, when you are tired, when you are distracted, when your resources are depleted, to raise the most charged and difficult subjects. Not because the timing is coincidental. Because depleted people are reachable people. These are not random behaviors. They are, consciously or not, situational weapons. And they all operate on the same mechanism. They are trying to catch you before you are ready. The defense against all of them is the same, and it is simpler than you might expect. Decide, in advance, that you are always ready. Not in an aggressive, hypervigilant, exhausting way. But in the quiet, settled, prepared way of someone who has already made peace with uncertainty. Who has already accepted that situations will not always unfold on a predictable schedule. Who has already committed, internally, privately, completely, to responding rather than reacting regardless of when or how the pressure arrives. Surprise loses its power the moment you stop being surprised by the existence of surprise. When the late information arrives, you breathe. You evaluate. You respond from your values rather than your panic. When the new demand appears at the 11th hour, you pause. You recognize the mechanism. You respond from your prepared position rather than from the disruption. When the difficult conversation is timed to catch you at your lowest, you slow down. You create space. You refuse to let the timing determine the quality of your response. This is not passivity. This is the most active, intentional, sophisticated thing a person can do in a high-stakes situation. It is the decision to be unambushable. There is a particular kind of person in any situation that deserves its own examination. The person who uses your emotions against you. Not openly. Not crudely. But with the subtle, practiced expertise of someone who has learned, through years of interaction and instinct, exactly which emotional frequency to broadcast in order to produce the reaction they need from you. They know when to be vulnerable, just vulnerable enough to activate your empathy and redirect the conversation away from accountability. They know when to be wounded, just wounded enough to make your legitimate concern feel like cruelty. They know when to be confident and when to be uncertain, when to push and when to retreat, when to escalate and when to suddenly become reasonable, always calibrated to produce a specific response in you. And the most important thing you can understand about this dynamic is not how to fight it. It is how to see it. Because the moment you see the mechanism, the moment you recognize, with clarity and without drama, that what is happening is not spontaneous human interaction but a pattern designed to produce a specific outcome in you, the mechanism stops working. Not because you become cold. Not because you stop caring. But because caring and being manipulated through your caring are two entirely different things. And you can only distinguish between them when you are watching the situation clearly rather than living inside your reaction to it. A woman named Serena spent 4 years in a professional partnership that consistently left her feeling off balance. Her partner Marcus was brilliant, genuinely, undeniably brilliant. But he had a particular skill that Serena couldn't name for the longest time. Whenever a decision needed to be made that might not favor him, whenever accountability was approaching or a difficult conversation was unavoidable, Marcus would become, suddenly and completely, overwhelmed. Uncertain. Almost fragile. He would share his struggles with such apparent authenticity that Serena would find herself, every single time, redirecting her energy from the issue at hand to supporting him through his difficulty. And the issue would quietly disappear. This happened for 4 years before Serena saw it clearly. She told me the moment of recognition felt less like anger and more like clarity. Like a fog she had been living in had suddenly lifted and she could see the landscape she had been navigating all along. She didn't confront Marcus dramatically. She didn't punish him. She simply stopped being available to the pattern. The next time the vulnerability appeared on cue, she acknowledged it genuinely, briefly, and then returned to the issue. I hear that you're finding this difficult. I want to support you through it. And I also need us to finish this conversation. Both things. At the same time. With complete calm. Marcus had no move after that. Because the move only worked when the emotional activation was total. When Serena maintained both her care and her clarity simultaneously, the lever had nothing to pull. See the mechanism. Keep your care. Lose your reactivity. That combination is almost impossible to manipulate. The dichotomy of control. What is yours? What is not? Epictetus built his entire philosophy, the philosophy that influenced Marcus Aurelius, that shaped Roman thought, that has informed the most effective psychological frameworks of the modern era, on this single, radical, clarifying distinction. Some things are in your control. Your judgments. Your responses. Your values. The quality of attention you bring to a situation. The preparation you do before it arrives. The story you choose to tell about what is happening. The energy you carry into the room. Everything else, other people's behavior, the outcome of the negotiation, whether your argument lands, whether you are understood, whether the situation resolves in the way you hoped, is not in your control. And the reason this distinction is so critical to situational power is this. Every ounce of energy you spend trying to control what is not yours to control is energy stolen from the things that are. The person trying to manage everyone else's reaction is not managing their own clarity. The person trying to force a specific outcome is not bringing their best thinking to the situation. The person desperately trying to be understood is not focusing on whether they are being effective. And in every case, the energy misdirected toward the uncontrollable is the energy that would have produced the very outcome they were trying to force. Release the grip on what you cannot control. Not because it doesn't matter, but because the grip is costing you the thing that matters most, the quality of your own response to what is happening. When you are fully, completely, genuinely focused only on what is yours, your thinking, your preparation, your energy, your values, your response, something remarkable happens in situations. You stop being a participant in the chaos. You become the stillness at the center of it. And stillness, real, grounded, unperformed stillness, does not just survive situations. It shapes them. There is a concept in physics that I find deeply useful here. The concept of the fulcrum. In a system of competing forces, a lever, a balance, a scale, the fulcrum is the point around which everything else moves. It is not the largest element. It is not the loudest. It does not push or pull or assert itself against the forces around it. It simply holds its position. And everything else organizes itself in relation to it. The most powerful people in any situation are not the ones applying the most force. They are the ones who have become the fulcrum. The stable point around which the energy of the situation moves. The presence that, by its very groundedness, determines the shape of everything around it. A leader named Emmanuel understood this in a way that transformed the culture of every team he led. Emmanuel was not the most technically gifted person in his organizations. He was rarely the most experienced. But he had developed, through years of deliberate practice and honest self-examination, the ability to be genuinely, completely unruffled in a crisis. Not performed unrufflement. Not the brittle, forced calm of someone suppressing panic. Real stillness. The kind that came from having already done the internal work. From having already examined his fears and made peace with the worst realistic outcomes. From having already decided, in the quiet before the storm, who he was going to be when the pressure arrived. And the effect of that stillness on the people around him was not subtle. In a crisis, his teams didn't panic. Not because the situation wasn't serious. But because the most important signal any human nervous system looks for in a high-stakes moment, is it safe to think clearly right now, or do I need to go into survival mode? Was being answered by Emmanuel's presence before anyone had a chance to spiral. He was the fulcrum. And the situation organized itself around him. You do not become the fulcrum by trying to control other people. You become it by achieving such complete, honest, practiced control over yourself that the people and situations around you naturally orient to the stability you carry. This is the deepest expression of what we have been building across both parts of this conversation. Situational control is not external. It never was. It is internal. Completely, fundamentally, always internal. And it is built, not found, not inherited, not stumbled into, through the daily, disciplined, unglamorous practice of returning to yourself. Of examining your reactions before they become your responses. Of preparing before the pressure arrives. Of releasing the outcomes you cannot control and investing completely in the response only you can give. Let me give you something to carry out of this conversation. A practice. Simple. Demanding. Transformative if you actually do it rather than just finding it interesting. Every morning, before the day begins its demands, before the situations arrive with their pressures and their competing forces, spend 5 minutes in what the Stoics called a morning preparation. Not journaling for its own sake. Not meditation as escape. A specific, intentional practice of asking yourself 3 questions. What situations might challenge my control today? Name them. Specifically. The conversation you are dreading. The person who consistently destabilizes you. The outcome you are anxious about. Name them, in the quiet, before they arrive, and take away their power to surprise you. What is actually within my control in each of those situations? Strip away everything that belongs to other people, to chance, to outcomes you cannot guarantee. What remains, your preparation, your energy, your response, your values, is where every ounce of your attention belongs. Who do I intend to be in those situations? Not what do I intend to achieve. Not what outcome do I intend to produce. Who, at the level of character, at the level of inner state, at the level of the person I am when I am most fully myself, do I intend to be? Answer those 3 questions every morning. In writing if you can. In the quiet of your own mind if you cannot. And then walk into your day as someone who has already decided. The situations will still arrive. The pressure will still come. The people who want to destabilize you will still try. But they will be meeting someone different than they met before. They will be meeting someone who has already been in that room, in the quiet of their own preparation, and already decided exactly who they are going to be. And that person, decided, grounded, prepared, genuinely unattached to being controlled by what they cannot control, is the person that situations simply cannot. If this conversation sharpened something in you, if something across part 1 and part 2 shifted the way you see the situations in your life and the power that is genuinely available to you within them, then I want you to understand something. This is what the Stoic path does. Every single week. We don't come here for surface-level motivation that evaporates by Tuesday. We come here for the deep, honest, philosophically grounded conversations that actually change the way you think, the way you carry yourself, and the way you move through a world that is constantly competing for your reaction. If that is the kind of content that feeds the person you are becoming, and I believe it is, then subscribe to the Stoic Path right now. Hit that button. Turn on your notifications. Because there is an entire library of conversations like this one waiting for you here. And what we are building on this channel, week by week, conversation by conversation, is a community of people who are serious. Serious about understanding themselves. Serious about living with intention. Serious about becoming the kind of person that pressure cannot break and situations cannot own. Share this with someone who needs it. Someone who has been losing the rooms they walk into because nobody taught them where the real power actually lives. Someone who is tired of being reactive and ready to become deliberate. Someone who is one conversation away from seeing everything differently. Send it to them. Because that is how communities like this one grow, not through algorithms, but through people who found something real and couldn't keep it to themselves. This is the Stoic path. And the person you are becoming, grounded, prepared, sovereign, and genuinely in control of the only thing that was ever truly yours to control, is worth every step of this journey. Keep walking.